So good morning, everyone. Wanted to thank you all for joining us today. My name is Jack McDougall, and I'm the President and CEO of the Greater Washington Board of Trade. We're continuing to experience the most unprecedented fallout you could imagine from this COVID-19 pandemic. And there really isn't any context for trying to understand its speed, its scope, and its scale, both from a the public health aspects, as well as the devastating effects on our businesses and economy. So amongst many things, the Board of Trade is continuing to host a series of calls like this one to share key insights on these impacts and the recovery ahead. Yesterday, Tom Barkin, the President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, offered some interesting views on the national economy and monetary policy. Last week, K&L Gates presented a detailed overview of the CARES Act with a focus on small businesses. Next week, McKinsey & Company will join us to discuss how our healthcare system is adapting and changing. One of the things that we've seen that's very interesting is a dramatic rise in telehealth, amongst other things. And all these discussions are available on our website. So if you've missed something and you're interested in the topic, please check that out. Today, we're especially excited to host Jeannette Chapman. She's a director at the Fuller Institute for Research at George Mason's Schar School. She's going to provide us with some new analysis on the economic outlook for our region. Just briefly, Jeannette joined George Mason in 2013, and her work examines our region's economy, demographics, and housing market. Previously, she was a research associate for economic growth and development at the downtown DC BID. She received a bachelor's degree in economics and foreign affairs at the University of Virginia and a master's degree from public policy from George Mason University. We're really lucky to have her with us here today. And briefly, the Stephen S. Fuller Institute is our region's premier source for information and analysis on the economy. Through consistent monitoring of regional issues, the Institute is able to identify critical conditions and trends impacting the future vitality of our region's economy. And such analysis is needed more now than ever. So please remember, throughout the conversation, if you have questions, use the chat box. We expect this to be a lively discussion. And Jeannette, thank you very, very much for joining us today. And now I'll turn it over to you.
Good morning, Jack and everyone. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank you for having me. I am going to launch right into this. I am going to start with an overview of the economy, both briefly nationally and regionally prior to the pandemic. That helps set the context and briefly discuss what we knew when with prior recessions. That's going to be important when we think about how we're measuring and what we can know about this current recession. So next slide, please. Next. So prior to this pandemic, the U.S. economy was in the longest business expansion on record, with data going back to 1854. This slide shows the business expansion patterns for several recessions. The last one, after several recessions, the last one is in red, and you can see that it was slow and it was very long. The pandemic has ended this. The main definitional issues when it comes to defining what a recession is usually has to mean 2 consecutive quarters of economic contraction, and the U.S. definition also includes somewhat significant income losses. So it is a little more subjective than just a checkbox list of those two quarters of contractions. Based on what we know right now, it is very likely that the U.S. will have and is currently in a recession. In order to meet the threshold for depression, I think there's some headlines talking about us being in a depression. The main differentiating factor is the length of the economic contraction. And so this would have to continue for a much more extended period of time than it is currently forecasted to in order to meet the definition of a depression. That may seem like semantics, but I think that sometimes we're starting to use what are kind of wonky terms in ways that they're not meant to be used. So we know that it is very likely that the U.S. is in a recession that will last probably through the end of the year to some degree, with some recovery towards the end. The question of exactly how deep and how long are going to be mostly tied to the health crisis. So unlike other economic business cycles, this is not a business cycle, this is a health crisis, and so the health crisis will determine what the business cycle looks like. So next slide, please. The U.S. is in the longest, had been in the longest business expansion on record. That was not true for the Washington region. Our last recession was actually in the 2013-2014 period. You can see how our economic path has differed from the U.S. in the past. The Washington region is in the red line, and we had a small contraction in 2013. This just shows annual data, but it probably lasted a little bit into the first quarter of 2014 as well. The U.S. did not have this dip. This was because of sequestration and the drawdown in the stimulus and a few other federal policy changes that happened all at the same time. Conversely, our region really didn't have a recession in 2009 as measured by economic activity. On the next slide, you can see that based just looking on the jobs data, it looks like the 2009-2010 recession that happened nationally also happened here. What gets lost in these just top line jobs data is what really is going on beneath the surface. During the 2009-2010 period, the Washington region was shedding lower wage jobs and lower value add jobs, but it was actually still adding the highest value professional workers, that the office workers, professional, technical, and scientific workers during that period. And so the net effect on the aggregate economy was different than just looking at what the jobs pattern was. Similarly, you can see that in that 2014-2013 period, there's a clear slowdown in job growth, but the losses aren't nearly as acute. That understates what was happening in the mix of jobs, where we were adding a large number of low-wage jobs, leisure, health, home health care aides, but we were losing our professional jobs. That's when our office vacancies started to spike even more than they had been after the recession. So one of the things that is going to be incredibly tricky for this pivot point is measuring it in real time. All of these data lag by several months at least, and there's not usually one single number that you can look at that will tell you exactly what's going on everywhere. The next slide shows the Washington region's Coincident Index. And in this is produced by the Fuller Institute, and it includes 4 different components, and one of which is jobs. However, it does usually do a slightly better job of measuring these pivot points. The sequestration dip shows much more clearly than just looking at the jobs data. And the recession losses aren't quite, well, they're longer, but they're not quite as large just on a percentage basis. And so this report is released on basically a 2-month lag, and will probably be, if you need just one data set to look for to try to figure out the depth and the timing of what is happening, this will be one of the better sources, just because it includes, it's a composite of 4 different indicators, and it does usually track a little bit better. The next slide shows the counterpart to the Coincident Index. The Coincident Index is designed to measure what's happening in real time. The Washington Region Leading Index is designed to measure the economic conditions in 6 to 8 months in advance of the data release. This is, again, consists of 4 different composite components, or 4 different components, and is based off of business cycle and economic factors. It does not incorporate the relevant health metrics because generally speaking, economic contractions are not caused by health crises. And what this means is that the leading index right now is still positive, even though we know that it is not, we will not have positive growth in the next few months. And instead, the leading index in the next several months will probably mostly also reflect what's happening currently. There are some indicators in this index, like building permit, that if they continue to lag, it will be an indicator of how much longer the recession lasts. But in general, this leading index won't show us when our economy is going to turn around, as well as just looking at the health crisis and looking at the statistics about when the curve really bends and when things look like they're going to improve. I will call out on this slide that you can see that it had been trending down since the middle of 2018. And the next slide shows the main reason for this, and that is really because our labor force had become unsustainably tight, especially when you couple this with labor force participation rates. We were well below what we had been below what we had sort of normal cyclical patterns for our labor force indicators. And over time, that does erode job growth because businesses have difficulty finding workers. Moving forward, the leading indicator is going to plummet, and it won't plummet for the underlying business cycle reasons that it typically does. And I know I'm reiterating this multiple times because this isn't a normal economic contraction. It's a health crisis that requires a different day-to-day behavior that then changes what's happening in the economy. So I'm going to move ahead and talk a little bit about what we know is happening because of the pandemic. And the next sort of fast forward 2 slides, we can skip the title slide. The first thing that really was an early sign of what was going on is that air travel plummeted. This shows national checkpoints, so the number of passengers getting checked by TSA each day compared to essentially the prior year, the same day of the prior year. In early March, they were running around even with 2019. Over the next 2 or 3 weeks, that dropped off to about 80%, and now as of the first week of April, it's running around 90, sort of, where they're at 5%. The number of travelers that are moving through air decreased exponentially and very, very quickly. Usually, most of the metrics will follow the same path in that early March, things looked fairly normal, but by mid-March, we were at sort of 50% of activity levels, and that at the end of March, depending on what industry you're looking at, it was down to maybe between 5 and 80% of activity levels, especially for things that involve tourism. Most of our data aren't designed to measure things on a daily basis, and depending on what their snapshot is, you will see a slightly different picture. Usually, under normal conditions, even under normal recessionary conditions, that matters less because things happen very gradually and cumulatively. That was not the case in March. Things happened extremely quickly, and the way that we measure our economic activity generally is always going to lag. And one of the problems with this is that we don't have a full set of metrics to measure from, and we won't probably for several months. And so instead, we're looking at these daily numbers, trying to extrapolate what that means. So we all know that tourism has dropped off. The next slide shows what this has meant so far nationally for the hotel industry. And you can see the same pattern. These are weekly data, so they don't fall, the trajectory is a little bit different, but they're more or less tracking what happened with TSA checkpoints. The hotel occupancy rates are down a little bit less than the TSA numbers, mainly because hotels can pull from local travelers and they can pull from other types of workers in the region. So right now, I'm guessing that instead of being down 95%, hotel occupancy nationally is probably down sort of in the 80% range, and I'm ballparking here. The Washington region's numbers are following a very similar trajectory, and the next slide shows you how this path has unfolded for restaurants. This is in dining. These are restaurant reservations, so this is in restaurant dining. And the red line shows the week or the daily over the year change for reservations in the District of Columbia, and the blue shows the change in the US overall. There is very little difference between these two lines, which again highlights the fact that the Washington region isn't different during this recession, especially when you look at this by industry. The restaurant industry has been hit very hard nationally. That is true locally as well. Another thing to call out on this slide is that even prior to the official closure of in-restaurant dining, restaurant demand had fallen precipitously because of the health crisis. That would have likely continued anyway, and in particular in our region, where the most highly educated of the major metros, and our residents are absolutely paying attention to what's happened, and they are absolutely changing their behavior. They would have done this without any policy intervention, and instead what's happened probably is that the people on the fringe, the 20-year-olds that weren't paying attention, that's what the policies are designed to do. Most of our residents are probably a little bit more responsive than average, just because they're paying a little bit more attention. Again, this is all based off of reading between the lines, but I think that's probably true. So one of the narratives that has kind of emerged is this: it's a binary, it's either health or economy, and that's it's less true than the headline would make you maybe believe, because people in our region in particular understand that labor is the economy, and people will change their behavior regardless. So moving on to the next slide, another major sector that was hit immediately and essentially went to zero are the entertainment venues. This just shows movies nationally, the box office nationally, and it's down roughly very nearly 100%. Apparently there's a screen or two open somewhere. Museums, sporting events, theaters, all will follow the same trajectory. And so the hotels, restaurants, and entertainment, they constitute the leisure and hospitality industry, which has come to a near standstill. It's essentially been shut down, both because of a precipitous decrease in demand, but also because of some marginal policy changes that were put in place in order to kind of get that last 5–10% of people to try to change their behavior. The next major sector that has been hit that we know of very hard and immediately has been the retail sector. And the next slide shows it's more of a forecast for what's happened in retail sales starting around March. The food store sales are the line that spikes up a little bit, and then the green line that stays flat are what are called non-store retail. That is online sales. Those are the ones that will hold up fairly well, but there's not enough of a bump up in either of those to counteract the decrease in all other sales. And this includes clothing, home goods, motor vehicles, durable goods, non-durable goods, everything. People, aside from the essentials, people are pulling back on their spending. People like to be able to see what they're buying. So if you can't go to the store, then you're not buying it. One of the main questions about this recession is what kind of recovery path we will follow. And early on in the pandemic, there was talk of what's being termed a V-shaped recovery. a very steep decline followed by a completely equally steep and large bounce back, because so this would be akin to what happens during government shutdowns in our area, where everybody just stops doing everything for a few weeks, and then once the shutdown has been resolved, we just return to normal right away. That would have only been true for this pandemic if the pandemic was controlled really fast. It has not been, and so the recovery is not going to be that V-shaped recovery. Instead, it is very likely to be either what's called they're calling it either a U or a swoosh, so that that demand returns more incrementally. And I know that on this retail sales chart, it looks like it's going to be more of a V, where that's that steep decrease and then immediate bounce back. Because this measures the change from the prior year, it's actually more of a swoosh. And retail demand for the U.S. doesn't return fully to 2019 levels until 2022. And so the longer the pandemic lasts, the flatter the recovery curve will be, because people will be more reluctant to return to spending. And because I'm using this chart to illustrate the consumer spending patterns overall that include the tourism and the restaurant piece and entertainment piece as well, that these sectors constitute the front lines of what is happening in the economy. And so when they recover, they will also be on the front lines of the recovery. And so the demand pattern there will be illustrative about what's happening on the recovery front. The next major change that has happened both regionally and nationally, it was shown in the next slide, or I've tried to illustrate it in the next slide, is that we've sent all of our professional workers that can go home, we've sent them home to work. And this shows the change in, it's primarily commuters. Commuters represent the largest share of miles traveled for most of these metros. And the Washington region was down 41% as of March 27th, just that Friday, compared to a typical Friday. That's exactly the same decrease as it was nationally, and most of the metros that I'm showing here are within a reasonable range. So just another data point to suggest that the Washington region will follow more or less the same trajectory as the nation does here, and that as of right now, or as of March 27th, you can roughly extrapolate this 40% decrease to the share of our workers that were sent home or weren't able to work. The one piece of our economy that is part of what is happening nationally that won't happen here is shown on the next slide, or at least initially, is the change in manufacturing in particular. That's the red line. This shows the manufacturing index. When it's below 50, it represents a contraction, a manufacturing contraction. Our region is less dependent on manufacturing than others, and we have fewer, in particular, international supply chain issues when it comes to manufacturing. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't some businesses that do rely on international manufacturing, so this isn't a broad-based statement, but in general, we have a smaller share of our economy that's tied to this, so we will be slightly less insulated on that front. Now, the national jobs data in March were released on Friday, and I have some slides next that show this, this decrease. And the national and local jobs data are measured as of the pay period of the 12th. So this only reflects what was happening through mid-March, and it only counts people that are getting paid during that pay period. Usually I don't need to do, usually the methodology matters much less, but here it matters a lot. The national economy lost roughly 700,000 jobs between February and March. That number was much larger than was anticipated because of the timing of this survey. And It was a little bit of a surprise because most of the more frequent data shows that precipitous decrease not really happening until the last 2-3 weeks of March. So this is an early warning indicator that the depth of the initial shutdown across some sectors was stronger and faster than even those daily or weekly numbers would suggest. This slide shows that monthly change based off of these major sectors. The leisure and hospitality sector was hit the hardest. That's very clear. One of the things that may be a little bit surprising is that there were decreases in sectors that maybe aren't intuitive, including the education and health services and the professional and business service sector. The professional and business service sector is particularly important for our region, and so what's happening nationally we need to pay attention to that so that we can figure out what's going to happen locally. The jobs data for us won't be released until next week. Now, the next slide breaks this apart into very detailed subsectors. And in the leisure and hospitality service, the first thing that was on the chopping block were restaurant jobs, restaurant and bar jobs. That's that top line. And then the next subsector that had the largest absolute decreases are these temporary help services. And this is the professional and business service decrease. Usually at the beginning or at the end of a recession, you start to see movement in temp jobs. And these jobs were shed very quickly and very early during this recession, and that will probably happen here as well. In the education and health service sector, that decrease is primarily because of that third bar, which is ambulatory health care. These are walk-in doctor offices and walk-in health services. The dentists and physical therapists and those types of offices did shut down faster. And so even though the healthcare numbers, we may think that they should be rising, in aggregate, they're actually falling. The education component right now is farther down in this chart, and it's in the middle of the chart. It's the child daycare services. And so those are preschools. These are private child care services that aren't in the home. So those going forward are still likely to be the largest education and health components that are cut. The rest of the decreases are more or less as expected. Construction, just as a note, is probably mostly affected by two factors, at least in the February to March numbers. The first is that February was very warm. And so even though these are adjusted for seasonality, it doesn't adjust perfectly for every season because there are differences over time. And so that probably exacerbates the decrease. The second is that this construction decrease probably mostly represents what's happening in the oil and mining industry and the number of rigs that aren't going up because of the decrease in oil prices and generally the erosion of demand in that. So it isn't the things that we do here. We'll have to wait another month to see if that continues. The rest of these subsectors are more or less as expected with personal care services and retail services. The note of caution is on the next slide. This shows the percentage decrease, not just the number of jobs. And the food service and restaurants and bars lost about 3.4% of their jobs in between February and March of this year. That is the tip of the iceberg, and the same for all of these other sectors. The immediate impacts are going to be hyper concentrated in these sectors, at least in the first wave of economic contraction. And even so, just the hypothetical of if restaurants drop 80% of their workers from payroll, which I think is it sounds large, but based off of what we know, what is happening, it's not an unreasonable number. That would result in a monthly decrease of 6 million jobs. And as a reminder, we have over 151 No, I'm sorry. So it would result in a decrease of 6 million jobs. And so when you're hearing the sort of the 10 to 20 million job losses that are projected nationally, it is still primarily concentrated in these sectors, and it's very easy to get to those numbers based off of a shutdown in just these industries. The more timely data that other people are measuring is on the next slide, and it is the number of jobless claims in the US. And because this recession has happened extraordinarily quickly, instead of just looking at a weekly number, that there isn't a comparable weekly number. Other recessions have never happened this quickly, and there haven't been this degree of broad-based shutdown in the economy ever. Instead, I am showing the first 2 weeks of new claims of this pandemic compared to right now a 13-week total in 2008, 2010, depending on whatever the peak was. Right now, the number of jobless claims that we know of, and this is at a lag, is about as many as happened during a 13-week period in the 2008 recession. That is just extremely unusual, and unfortunately, given the way that this recession is rolling out, we won't really have a good measure for comparison for another few weeks. It is very likely that restaurants are going to be shedding shedding workers very, very quickly in order to try to survive this cut. They know what's happening, and they know that they're going to be closed for the foreseeable future. Once those, for example, restaurant workers are shed, and once those frontline sectors have shed their workers, the new claims will taper off most likely. And then when that happens, we'll be able to get a better benchmark about what's actually happening in this recession compared to other recessions. Now, locally, the next slide shows the numbers for DC, the Commonwealth of Virginia, and the state of Maryland. The region is probably following more or less the same path. This is based off of job location, and DC has about twice as many jobless claims in those 2 weeks as compared to the recession. Again, our recession wasn't exactly a recession, so that's one reason that these numbers are a little bit skewed. And Virginia and Maryland overall as states have about the same. So we are just harping on this a little bit more. We're used to being special. We're not special now. We're special, but for some tiny reasons, but in general, you can see what's happening nationally and extrapolate to the local situation. So moving ahead to what is likely to happen and what the forecasts are. So next slide, please. Now, those are the sectors that I discussed earlier based off of those high frequency data that we know they've come to a near standstill. These sectors represent almost about 1/5 of our jobs in the region. The caveat is these sectors are more likely to be low wage and represent a smaller share of economic output, because partially you can think about wages as corresponding to the economic output. It's not perfect, but it's easier intuitively. They only represent about 8% of our economy. And the jobless claims, again, are hyper concentrated, and the job losses are hyper concentrated in industries that typically have lower wage scales and are more likely to have part-time workers. And therefore, it's not a one-to-one, it's not an average decrease. It's skewed towards the low end. So we can have a really large number of jobless claims and large degrees of job losses that don't translate to the same degree of economic decline. Now, that doesn't mean what this does mean is that it is hyper concentrated in terms of its distribution, but it doesn't translate kind of one-to-one, which makes these data even noisier to interpret. The next slide, though, highlights one of the major concerns, is both nationally and locally, is that the job losses and these sectors are disproportionately the employment base for lower wage households. Roughly 65% of these households in the Washington region earn less than $100,000. That is much different than the rest of our workforce, and so the distributional effects here are going to be exaggerated or exacerbated, and this is also different than other business cycle recessions that tend to be slightly more balanced because there's a mix of higher wage and lower wage jobs that are hit. And so instead, this is continue to bifurcate our economy and our workforce even more, because the people that in many ways are the least able to absorb these economic losses are the ones that are being burdened with them the most. Now, the next slide shows the forecast for 2020 and 2021, and I have two forecasts right now. The red trajectory shows a contraction of about 0.8 percentage point in 2010 overall, and a bounce back of about 3% in 2021. This forecast assumes that essentially after this round of stay-at-home, we have clarity and we can move on fairly quickly. We have a path towards reopening, and that consumers and people in our region have a stronger recovery in their confidence, and they don't lose very much income, and they start reopening things very quickly. It is less likely that we are on this path right now. Instead, I think we're moving quickly towards the green path that has a contraction of about 1.6%, and then a bounce back of 2% in 2021. One of the caveats here is that the economic contraction won't just scale linearly as we move forward. We will jump between points as people hit new thresholds. And I suspect the next pivot point in what's going to be the economic path for us will come probably around next week, when we figure out whether or not these stay-at-home measures are working. And so the health crisis again will determine that. If at the end of next week, it's clear that this is working, I think businesses will start to plan again, and we can stay closer to that red path. If it's clear at the end of next week that what we're doing right now is insufficient or it's too soon to tell, we will probably have another round of industry level shutdowns where businesses have been holding on for as long as they can, and they realize that they can't hold on for another month, and so they need to take action soon. The next slide shows some of the other reasons why this is this economic contraction will get worse faster than I think other recessions have had, or it has happened for other recessions. And as I mentioned, the first thing is that right now these semi-shutdowns are hyper-concentrated by sector, and going forward that will spread. The professional services, right now most of us can work from home, but eventually we'll hit pivot points, and right now it's pay freezes and hiring freezes, but eventually that will translate into job losses. The corollary to that is when the economic contraction spreads to these other sectors, it will result in more income loss. The income loss in the vulnerable service workers that I talked about earlier is it's a still relatively small share of our economy. As this spreads to our finance sectors, our professional sectors, our construction sectors, it will get amplified. And what that means is that the post-pandemic demand from consumers in our area will not return to what it was pre-pandemic because people will have lost income in absolute terms. That means that that will suppress the recovery. The third piece I've mentioned is consumer sentiment. It isn't just, people don't just spend what they have, they change their behavior based off of what they think is going to be happening and what kind of faith they have in the economy and other institutions. The longer the pandemic continues, the harder it will be for households to be bullish on just the overall situation, even after the pandemic, because we will have had that psychological imprint of whatever did not work during this pandemic. The last piece is economic bottlenecks. I mentioned that right now the economic bottlenecks are primarily manufacturing based, and that's not something that we need to worry about. As we drag on, as we all work from home, the bottlenecks will be compounded in other industries and become more complex and harder to get past. And this is going to be industry specific, but they're anything from, we're all postponing meetings, we're all postponing planning. The longer we postpone these plans because of uncertainty, the less able we are to bounce back quickly because we don't have the strategies in place. So the next slide shows that first bullet point of potentially at-risk industries. And I'm showing this just to highlight that in general, these sectors represent a smaller share of jobs compared to their economic output, or at least the same share of jobs, unlike those first immediately at-risk industries. And just to highlight the fact that as this spreads to other sectors, the economic impact of it will be much larger, and not just because it's moving into a more broad-based economic impact, but it's because these sectors represent more output, and therefore the multiplier effect is going to be much larger. And I will close with just the final thing is the consumer sentiment numbers, the consumer confidence numbers are going to be something that everyone's going to be watching very closely. That's what's shown in the next slide, because there is going to be a psychological component to all of this that is not really captured in these quantitative data, and we won't really know the full scale of how people change their behavior until after this is all over. And I think with that, I think I'm going to move to questions, and I know that there are a few that came in before, but I'm maybe get Najia to say some from the chat before I start on the questions that were submitted prior.
Sure, Jeanette. Before you get started on those questions, there was one question submitted through the chat, and everyone listening, feel free to submit some more questions as we go. The question is, what is considered a food store? 7-Eleven?
Those are probably general merchandise. So I think, I don't know what it usually, it is going to be anything where food is the main sales item. And I don't know what like 7-Eleven is, but generally it'll be that main food places and drinking places, whatever the terminology is, mostly restaurant and bars, but it does include like catering and not just restaurants, not just full service restaurants. It's fast casual and probably specialty food items as well.
Thank you, Jeanette. Is there any research on how stimulus bill will impact the DC regional economy?
For this, I hesitate to call it a stimulus because it's not exact. It's more of a stabilizer than a stimulus. But in this case, unlike the last, what was truly a stimulus after the 2008-2009 recession, we aren't going to get a disproportionate benefit from it. We may actually have less benefit because, especially on the household payment side, because we're a wealthier metro. The stimulus or the current stabilizer or recovery package is primarily designed to make the recovery as seamless as possible on the business side, the business loans, the grants, and that section of the package is meant to help recovery. And then on the household side, it's not designed to help keep people spending like other stimuluses. It's meant to be stopgaps so that people can pay for those necessities. And because of the nature of this shutdown, even if you gave people a significant bump in their income, just like a helicopter drop of money, that won't make this recession stop, because these industries are going to be shut down, and they need to be shut down because of the health crisis. And so it just this is a long-winded way of saying that we probably won't see any real economic boon from this recovery package until the recovery side. And instead, this is meant to try to stabilize some of these decreases.
Thank you, Jeannette. We had a few additional questions come in through the chat. Do you have any data on the impact on nonprofits?
The nonprofit sector is there's going to be very little data, to be honest. The giving numbers will probably be down, at least in the short term, as especially as households try to figure out what's actually going on with their incomes. That might recover after the pandemic ends, especially if household incomes remain more or less intact. A lot of our major nonprofits are national as well, and they tend to be more stable. So, you know, AARP and the big name nonprofits will probably sort of respond similar to another professional and business service kind of firm, but the smaller nonprofits are probably at risk.
Thank you. Do you foresee a growth in federal government spending in certain health science sectors based in the region towards fighting the pandemic?
There's only but so much short-term scale-up that can happen, because the biotech hiring is already a problem both in our region and nationally. And the research, it's hard to start new research. I know that has happened, but I think that's probably a marginal effect. In the long run, there's a possibility that the federal government does like what it did after other crises and ramp up the spending on that front. The problem that I see is that the deficit spending here and all of these the stabilizer packages are going to make that more difficult. And so it's a little less clear than it was, say, after 9/11 that federal government spending would ramp up, and the ramp up would probably be smaller.
Thank you, Jeannette. Why is the approximate 700,000 payroll jobs loss number shown in the presentation so much lower than the 3.3 and 6.6 million initial unemployment claims numbers reported in the past 2 weeks?
It's because of the timing. That's those 2 weeks are the roughly March 15th through March 27th, and the jobs data only show what's happening as of the pay period of March 12th. So that's before this even happened. And so that's, again, a note of caution when reading these jobs data. They're going to lag, and they only reflect basically a snapshot as of the middle of the month. And so this is just, the March numbers really only show what was happening those first 2 weeks of March, not even the first week and a half.
Thanks, Jeannette. Are you tracking the loss of tourism dollars in the DC region?
To some degree. The hotel numbers are easiest to track. What the caveat is that the hotel numbers are only a small percentage of the overall tourism. The retail and the shoppers goods numbers in particular we're going to have to track those after the fact. Something just to consider here is that, In general, international tourists spend much more and they stay here much longer than local tourists. And we know that that segment of tourism fell first, and it fell by a larger degree than local tourism. And that is probably going to continue for at least a year, just based off of the global situation. And so even if you're, again, just looking at those top line fall off in hotel revenues, the aggregate effect on the economy is going to be much larger, and it's probably going to be skewed downward even compared to what it would be in a normal year.
Thanks, Jeannette. We have one more question before we turn it over to Jack to close us out. How long would the decline have to occur? How big the contraction, in your opinion, for it to be considered depressionary?
Oh, that's a really good question. And I think I'm going to go with what the most likely depressionary scenario is. And this is, I'm kind of extrapolating based off of what the health experts are saying as well. So I'm not a health expert, but sort of that's where the economic impact is coming from. If we open too early, and so the hypothetical would be that at the end of next week, we think that everything has flattened, and then we just go back to our normal day to day, and then we have a second spike that's actually larger than the first. I think it's very likely that we'll have a second wave that's smaller, but if we open too early, the second spike will actually be larger because people will be moving too quickly back to their normal behavior. That would probably be the likely path to a more depressionary scenario or depression-like scenario, because then we would have to start over. And both the economic and the mental impact of that is going to just be exponential.
Thanks, Jeannette.
Well, that's great. I'm not sure that's the end note that we want here, but that was an interesting conversation. There's a lot of things. I mean, one of the things that we've been looking at too, just as a region, what are some of the things that we have to do to restore confidence so that people will start coming out, going back to restaurants, going back to retail, and doing some other things. So we're going to be looking at some efforts to get that underway so that, when we do all start getting back to work, that we can do some things that will accelerate that. But this is really, really interesting, Jeannette. Looking forward to continuing our conversations. And as you get new data and other information, I very much want to share that with folks. With that, I wanted to thank you very much for joining us today, and wanted to thank everybody else too for participating. And stay tuned. There's a lot more coming. And if you need other information, please check out our website. Everybody, please, stay safe, and we'll talk again soon. Thank you.